So you've just finished that film that you've put your heart, soul, sanity, and perhaps wallet into. And it's time to put it out into the world, and you hold your breath. Now let's assume that out of the thousands of films made every year, yours is in fact one of the tiny percentage that is great. But unless it is blessed with stars or producers with power, you're probably going to find the harsh reality that not even the majority of film festivals in the world are interested in a film with no power behind it. And distributors are worse. Never expect them to have much of an imagination over how to market and distribute your great film. But even if you do get one, who's to say they're going to be able to get it to perform? After all, 25% of the releases from the major independent film distributor, IFC, have grossed less than $15,000 at the US box office. So I was in this position. I had this film called Neither Wolf Nor Dog that had no clout behind it, and it was being totally ignored by the industry. But I knew it had an audience and that the film had a power that would reach them. It was based on a popular novel, and I knew if I could reach the fans of those novels, I would be able to self-distribute it and at least find some of them. But trust me, hardly anyone ever self-distributes, and especially without a publicist and a booker. But the novel had come out in the mid-90s, and for about 14 years, Hollywood producers had tried to get it made into a film, but they failed every time. And the author of the novel was getting sick and tired of all these empty Hollywood promises, and he approached me with it. And I made him a promise that I would get it made by any means necessary. But I tried conventional financing for a while, and it was just going nowhere. So with the help of amazing supporters through Kickstarter, I had the resources to go ahead. And time was of the essence, because at the center of the film was a Lakota elder, and there was only one person in the world who could play this role. His name was Dave Bald Eagle, and he was 93 years old when I met him. And there were these 2 very tense years while I was trying to pull the whole thing together, because if for any reason he was no longer able to do the role, then I was just prepared to turn away and walk away from all the years of time and money that I had put in up to that point, because everything that was going to make this film important was going to revolve around his spectacular performance. Now, the 110-minute long film was shot in about 125 combined filming hours, spread over about 18 shooting days. It was mostly on Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, which borders South Dakota and Nebraska in the US. My average crew size was 2, and it was only myself working on the film from pre-production all the way through post-production, delivery, and into distribution. Now, for theatrical distribution for a very small film, they say you should have at least $100,000 set aside for distribution and marketing. But I went into distribution with less than $1,000 spent. Now, the distribution system in the film world is actually very simple. It's basically a relationship between the distributors and film buyers, or bookers as they're also called, and the theaters that they represent. But the problem is it's a very closed-off world. There's no directory you can go to find out who they all are. And so at the end of the day, I had to try and get theaters interested directly, which is not an easy thing to do. But my distribution strategy was very simple. I wanted to be a big fish in a small pond and not a minnow in an ocean. And by that I mean your traditional distribution strategy for very small film is you pay to be in theaters in New York and Los Angeles, and then if it does very well, you might gain a few other theaters in some other big cities around the US. Whereas I, 62 weeks ago, released in 4 small theaters in 4 small communities in the United States, where the theaters recognized that there was a strong local audience for the film. And they were right. We were the #1 film, beating 9 Hollywood blockbusters at a multiplex in Bemidji, Minnesota, where the novel had been written and was best known. We ended up with 1,600 admissions in that town of 15,000 people because people drove so far to see it. And we had also done well in 2 small reservation theaters where 2 of our actors had been born and where the novel was, we knew we could get a lot of local attention. So big fish in a small pond was working. But our big breakthrough happened when we opened in the top theater in Minneapolis, the landmark Lagoon. And there it was a phenomenon. We found out that it was the first film to sell out a number of showings there since the previous Star Wars movie. And we ended up having more admissions that week than the film with the top screen average in the entire United States that week. They only beat us because they had inflated New York ticket prices. But also we started to find out the cultural impact the film was having also. We had a manager of the theater reach out to us, and she informed me of this elder white gentleman that approached her after the film, and she described him as the kind of man who you would never expect to show emotions to anyone, especially a stranger. But he could barely get his words out talking about the film because he was sobbing so hard. And this was the second time seeing the film. Now, as a result, we ended up having 3,500 admissions in that theater over 4 weeks. And to put that in context, the main other non-Hollywood Native American film released last year in theaters by a conventional distributor grossed less in 45 theaters in 1 week than we did in that one theater over 4 weeks. And their entire theatrical run lasted only 4 weeks. And as a result, we managed to get into some big chain multiplexes in the height of the summer blockbuster season. And we were holding our own, going toe-to-toe with these movies that were spending close to $100 million in marketing. And one of the things that I started to discover was it was far easier to book the film into theaters close to where we'd already been a hit. And that was no more seen than in the Pacific Northwest, especially after we became the second best performing film per showing in a year at the Kiggins Theatre, a small art house theatre in Vancouver, Washington. And we'd done so well there that we had outperformed 11 of the 12 summer blockbusters playing at a big chain multiplex down the road. Only Wonder Woman beat us, and it had had 35 showings that week, and we had had 6. And as a result of those clusters of success, 89 of our theaters have only been in the states of Minnesota, the Dakotas, Montana, Oregon, Washington, and Maine, states that make up less than 7% of the US market. Major releases from the likes of Sony Picture Classics and Fox Searchlight, these are the art house divisions of the big studios, would struggle to ever see that many screens in these states that we were doing so well in. But also, interestingly enough, 65% of the theaters that we were playing in were multiplexes and commercial theaters. So don't ever assume that a tiny little film only belongs in small independent theaters. Now, we treated every theater as if it was its own market, and we do massive amounts of outreach and get great local media in these markets. And we find that small to medium-sized towns perform by far the best for us, because the local newspapers and radio shows get so many listeners and readers in these areas, and they love running our story. And the other thing is that we've never done national media in the United States, and the great advantage of that is every time we go into a new market, the film has not been dated, so they love running our story. And so we've now gotten to the point where we have had the longest theatrical run in the United States of any movie released in the last decade. But I'm not giving up on theaters anytime soon, because right now the DVD market is pretty dead. The video on demand and the SVOD markets are really just controlled by the studios, and independents, like when you get as small as me, struggle to get into their mechanisms. So I have to keep proving the huge demand for this film in theaters. But yet, I've been in more theaters than the last 2 winners of the Palme d'Or Film Festival in Cannes in the United States market. And I mentioned the major independent film distributor IFC a little earlier. Last year, we outperformed 23 of their 26 theatrical releases. We outperformed all 32 from Kino Lorber, who are another prominent independent film distributor. But for the first 9 months of the distribution, I was working well over 100 hours a week. But now I'm beginning to assemble a bit of a team around me to assist with this, and my key right-hand person is in Los Angeles, and she handles the logistics and the marketing. But the rest of my team are with me in Bulgaria. And But the thing that you filmmakers out there have to realize is if you're listening to this and you think, well, this all sounds great, you know, all I have to do is give up my personal life and work myself into an early grave for a couple of years handling the release, then there's one central thing that you have to pay attention to. The one central thing that is key is, why should your audience care? What is it about your film that will make them fight for it? And I don't mean if it's just a great film or not, it needs something more. It needs to be something that is deeply important to them. Now, the final scene I filmed with Dave Bald Eagle was a climactic scene of the film at Wounded Knee, where in 1890, the United States 7th Cavalry massacred up to 300 Lakota people there. Now, we'd been hitting such a remarkable point of truth within the film, between the actors' performances, that we realized that what was in the novel and what was in the script seemed somewhat contrived compared to where we were now going with this, and it just wasn't going to work. So I did something that might seem crazy, having gone through such an incredibly long journey with this project up to this point. I threw away what was on the page, and I let Dave Bald Eagle improvise the entire sequence. Because Dave, in his own family background, were closer to the massacre of Wounded Knee than even the character he was playing. Now, when we started filming, there were a couple of false starts, and I was talking to Christopher Sweeney, who was playing the role opposite Dave, and we weren't even sure if this scene was ever going to work, and if this scene didn't work, then the entire film was going to collapse. But what was on the page wasn't going to work either. So we spoke to Dave again, and then started filming again. And crucially, because Dave trusted us, and because we had created an intimacy that would have been impossible in any other kind of film set, Dave went somewhere incredibly deep and incredibly powerful in that scene. And at the end of filming it, he turned to Christopher and he said, "I've been holding that in for 95 years. That is what he shared with the audience. They witness it in an extreme close-up in the film. They feel like they are standing there on this sacred land with this remarkable man experiencing something historic from a generation that is now gone." Sadly, Dave passed away at 97 years old. There will never be a moment like this on screen again, and that is why the audience is fighting for this film. It is why many see it many times. It's why they're telling their friends to go see it. Because a beautiful man put his spirit on screen. A man who is no longer with us made them laugh and cry and touch their hearts. And that's what you filmmakers have to ask yourself. Why will the audience care? Now, for us, the thing I've also found is that theaters are the greatest meritocracy in film. They never ask you who's in it or what has it won. They look at the box office reports and the audience score. The reason that my audience score is 4.7 on Rotten Tomatoes is not because the film is some kind of masterpiece, but it's because it moved them so much. The film's success is because of its touching of souls. But without the theatrical release, the film would have just been seen by a handful of people on DVD and would have gone nowhere. Whereas so far, around 65,000 people have seen it on over 140 theaters, and this is just the beginning. We've still got a long way to go with theaters in the US, and then we start moving it into theaters in Europe. And there's one thing I'm sure of, is that Dave Bald Eagle would have been thrilled. We showed the film to him not long before he passed away, and he said it was the only film he'd ever been in about his people that told the truth. And that is the response to the film for me that will always eclipse all others. And 7 years ago, I made a sacred promise to the author that I would get the film made by any means necessary. And as it turned out, that wasn't going to be the hardest part. But if you're prepared to distribute your film by any means necessary, and do what it takes to get it into theaters, you can find that you can make deeply important films successful without ever having to touch the rest of the film business other than those theaters. That you can become a truly autonomous filmmaker without compromise. And trust me, as a filmmaker, that really is a dawn of a beautiful new age for your career as a filmmaker. Thank you very much.